Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. I mean, it was a short coffee break, but I think we'll be able to get things back on time, because we're now starting the final, item of today, which is an item that perhaps needs very little by way of introduction. I think we've heard from the other session an awful lot, of action and policy focus on housing. Anna Claudia, for example, mentioned that UN Habitat itself was created as part of a reaction to the shelter crisis. Fundamentally for addressing issues around housing. And those issues, I think, haven't really changed over the last 30 years. I mean, the challenges around affordability and around scarcity remain, I think, key challenges today. But added to that, of course, we have also the decarbonisation agenda. So housing has been elevated, I think, in the policy discussion, even more so than the very high, discussion, elevation that it had many, many years ago. And I constantly remind myself that we're having a conversation today, I think that all of us have been affected by in one way or another. I mean, my mind goes back to when I was young, facing housing challenges and thinking that house prices in London back in the 1980s were extortionate. But today, if I had the chance to buy a house at that price, I'd bite your hand off. So I think we have a real challenge, but an opportunity, I think, to make some progress. And Mayor Hidalgo herself, I think, provided us with some fantastic numbers showing the scale of that progress, but also the scale of the challenges. And she mentioned that the number of people who have access or live in social housing in Paris had risen from 13 to 25% over the last few years. But still, there's a challenge because, of course, 70% of people are eligible for that social housing. So the scale is huge, but the potential, and I think the momentum that we see is moving in the right direction. And I think we're going to hear an awful lot of perhaps that positive momentum from the speakers that we have lined up today for this session. It's a session which we're co-organising with UN Habitat, Eurocities and Housing Europe, and why it's broken up into two sessions. So we're going to have a first round of discussions with three of our partners, very close collaborators on this issue, an issue that we worked on for 25 years at the OECD, and you're going to hear more about perhaps some of the high priority work we've done across the House on this report that I stole from Alain, who's going to wrap up at the end, the brick by brick report, that brought together all of the OECD different directorates who had responsibility or working on housing policies. And of course, there's a very strong place-based dimension, which is why today we're having that conversation around some of the urban challenges. But again, as Anna Claudia mentioned, we need to have an integrated approach, because when you think about the urban challenges, there are also challenges in other parts of the country. It's not just an urban phenomenon, even if we're discussing it today under the umbrella of the urban challenge. But without any further ado, because I do want to get us back roughly on time, so you can all head back to the cocktail at 18:15, I'm going to perhaps begin with a first round of questions. And the first question I'm going to ask to Andrei Sobchak, who's the Secretary General of Eurocities. And Andrei, cities across Europe are grappling with an unprecedented housing crisis, which is exacerbating social inequalities and placing significant strain on urban communities. So from the perspective of the Eurocities network, what are the key housing and homelessness challenges that member cities are currently confronting, and what innovative or impactful policy responses are being implemented at the local level to address these issues? And I remind everybody that you have 5 minutes each. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'm very honored to join this discussion on a topic that is indeed becoming more and more important for cities all over the world, but also particularly, of course, in Europe. At Eurocities, we are a network that brings together 200 cities in 39 countries in the EU, but also in other parts of Europe, and there is a converging picture indeed that appears. We every year analyze what are the key priorities of our mayors. We send them a survey, and over the 3 last years, housing and affordable housing has become more and more important. In the newest version of our pulse that will be released during our annual conference in Braga in June this year, we show that 39% of our mayors say that housing costs have become unaffordable for most residents. So if you have an average income, if you are a school teacher, a nurse, if you're providing social services, you cannot afford anymore to live in the city. You cannot pay the rent or the mortgage for buying a house. In only 14% of our cities, the mayors say that housing remains accessible. So it's really all over Europe that it's becoming something that is important. And when we asked mayors what are the reasons for it, the first reason is that the demand exceeds supply. 76% of the mayors say we have not sufficient housing in our cities, because there is, of course, a lot of economic growth going on in cities. Cities attract new populations from the outside, but there's also the demographic change that brings in more and more needs for housing, and also aspirations to have more space, of course. And in many cases, it was not possible to build as much houses as there was the demand for. But even if cities sometimes are able to build, then there's still another second challenge that arises, and that is pointed out by 71% of our mayors, which means that the construction costs have raised a lot, because there is inflation, of course, because there are labor shortages, there are supply chain issues, and of course land is also becoming more and more expensive in cities. So even if there are houses sometimes in cities, it's not affordable for those who have an average income anymore. And then, of course, there is also real estate speculation. It's also mentioned as a top 3 concern by 30% of our cities, because in those cities sometimes we have even free houses or a lot of office space, but it's not used because there's speculation. So cities, of course, and mayors in particular act to find solutions, as you mentioned and you asked in your question. So we have a lot of examples where cities like Milan, for example, they worked on the Casa ai Lavoratori initiative, where they provide public housing for essential workers, for example, and make sure that those who run our cities can still afford to live in them. We have a lot of cities also that fight against short-term rentals for tourists, trying to make sure that houses are for those who live in the city on a permanent way and not only for tourists. We have also a lot of cities like Paris, for example, where we are hosted that try to transform houses or military barracks in houses, or sometimes office space in houses as well, students' residences and public spaces that are created like this. And we also see more and more cities, of course, that try to make sure that the energy costs for houses also are becoming more affordable. So a lot of cities try to make sure that actually people can renovate their houses and sometimes do not have to spend money in advance. The city of Ghent, for example, has a program like this, and make sure that the loans that they get for renovating will be reimbursed immediately with the lower bills for energy. But housing is also, of course, a problem that has to be related to homelessness, which is also increasing a lot in Europe. 420,000 people do not have a home at all. And there are also a lot of cities that are acting, like Lyon Métropole, for example, that has developed Housing First as an initiative to make sure that everybody can have a home to then be integrated. We have also the Lisbon Declaration that tries to make sure that by 2030 we have no more homelessness, but it will be very difficult to achieve this aim. And also I often say that we need to remind this target. We know very well our targets for climate neutrality. We know much less our targets for homelessness. And a last initiative that I want to mention is the Mayors for Housing initiative, where we have 15 European mayors led by the mayors of Barcelona and Rome that are trying to work together with the European Commission and with Eurocities to develop the next housing plan. So at Eurocities, we are, of course, very happy that we have now our first ever Commissioner for Housing, and we have a task force that is also starting its work. We have seen that in the midterm review of the cohesion policy, there was announced that now the investment for housing is twice as important as previously, which is a good step, but of course far not enough. We need much more because, according to EIB, there is a need of 270 billion investments needed to manage to meet the housing needs in Europe. So it will be a lot. So we need more funding, of course, we need more loans, but we also need more regulatory tools for cities. Cities need to be able to curb speculation, to unlock vacant buildings, and to incentivize the reuse of underused office space for housing, for example. Housing is not only about buildings, it's about people, it's about opportunities, it's about dignity, it's about democracy. So I'm very happy that we have the opportunity here to listen to several actors, and I think that we will probably find good solutions how we can even work closer together under the umbrella of the OECD, of course, but also with all the different stakeholders to find solutions to manage to make progress on the housing crisis in Europe.
Many thanks, Andres. And you covered an awful lot there, and I think we'll have a chance to come back to some of the issues that you raised, in particular around the element of decarbonising, greening, but also on financing. But you also mentioned key workers, and I think that's a nice little segue to the question that I have for Emmanuel, and I'm going to switch very quickly to French for those of you who want to put your headphones on. So Emmanuel Cos, c'est le président de l'Union sociale pour l'habitat, et le former ministre de logement en France. Et donc, Emmanuel, la question pour vous, c'est l'Union sociale pour l'habitat joue un rôle clé dans la défense d'un secteur du logement social plus fort et plus résilient en France, en réponse à la demande croissante des logements abordables. Donc, quels sont aujourd'hui les atouts du modèle français de logement social et quels sont les principaux défis auxquels il est actuellement confronté?
Merci beaucoup pour cette invitation et merci à l'OCDE pour cette initiative. C'est extrêmement important pour nous de pouvoir défendre le modèle du logement social et aussi de présenter en fait que l'on peut avoir une offre de logement très accessible, très abordable avec une politique séculaire. Le modèle du logement social français, ah oui, alors j'ai une présentation, mais je ne sais pas si je peux passer les... Je ne sais pas comment on fait.
Il faut faire comme ça, même si tu n'as pas...
Même si je n'ai pas... Ah, ok. En tout cas, mon propos est un peu détaché de la présentation. Merci.
Pour vous.
Merci l'Europe.
Toujours à votre service.
Pas de souci. La France du modèle social HLM français, c'est un modèle qui est plus que centenaire et qui loge ou a logé un Français sur deux dans sa vie. C'est un outil indispensable pour un pays comme le nôtre et notamment un outil pour lutter contre les phénomènes de spéculation qui viennent d'être abordés. C'est aussi un modèle qui fait part d'une exception française car il est financé sur un financement au très long terme et ce qui explique aussi sa pérennité. Mais c'est aussi un logement qui est détenu de manière très longue par des organismes HLM et donc qui en fait entretiennent ces logements. Et c'est ce qui explique aussi que ce parc HLM reste important. Alors aujourd'hui, le logement social loge environ 18% de la population française. Il y a 57% des Français qui sont propriétaires, 25% qui sont locataires dans le parc privé et à peu près 18% dans le parc social. C'est environ 5,9 millions de logements. Là, vous avez 5 millions d'eux, c'est les logements familiaux. Et c'est donc entre 15 et 17% de la population. C'est un effet social réel car le logement social français, c'est un logement qui est loué aux environs de 6 € du mètre carré. En comparaison, le loyer parisien aujourd'hui est autour de 30 € du mètre carré. Donc c'est un marché très en deçà des prix très en deçà du marché, une offre très inférieure et qui correspond à des ménages qui ont des revenus modestes. Donc c'est ce qu'on appelle la classe moyenne basse. C'est les key workers, parce qu'aujourd'hui, en tout cas en France, un key worker, c'est quand même à des salaires extrêmement modestes, mais c'est essentiellement ce qui permet de loger ces personnes. En gros, le logement social français est pour une personne seule qui vit avec de 14 000 € à 35 000 € maximum. Ces atouts, c'est la résistance au modèle de spéculation, c'est une production du logement social qui ne s'est jamais arrêtée, y compris actuellement dans la crise immobilière, on continue à produire du logement social. Et c'est aussi un pilotage qui est très fort, notamment pour la rénovation des logements, puisqu'aujourd'hui, le parc de logements sociaux, le parc HLM français, réhabilite 4 fois plus vite que le parc privé et décarbone 4 fois plus vite que l'ensemble des logements. C'est enfin 17 milliards d'investissements l'année dernière dans l'économie française, la moitié pour de la production nouvelle et le reste pour de la réhabilitation. Et vous le voyez, c'est un parc HLM qui s'est construit au long cours. Excusez-moi, c'est un peu petit sur les graphiques, mais toutes ces données-là sont évidemment accessibles en français et en anglais, et on les fournira à l'OCDE. Et vous le voyez, ils sont essentiellement sur l'ensemble du territoire, avec une prépondérance du parc HLM dans les territoires qui connaissaient l'histoire industrielle française. Le financement du logement social, c'est son atout. Il est financé grâce à l'épargne populaire des Français. C'est le livret A. Et aujourd'hui, nous avons 180 milliards d'euros d'encours de dette auprès donc, de la Caisse des dépôts et consignations, le livret A, qui nous permet d'emprunter sur des longues durées, entre 40 et 60 ans, voire 80 ans pour acheter des fonciers, qui sont aujourd'hui extrêmement chers. Et c'est vraiment ce modèle d'emprunt très longue durée qui nous permet de sortir des loyers très bas, en sachant par ailleurs que nos organismes HLM utilisent les recettes de leurs loyers pour en fait les réinvestir dans ce modèle. Ce qui explique un modèle centenaire qui a permis de vraiment répondre aux besoins des Français. On est aussi financé par d'autres dispositifs, notamment ce qui s'appelle la PEC, la participation des employeurs à l'effort de construction. Toutes les entreprises françaises de plus de 50 salariés doivent payer un versement qui représente 0,46% de la masse salariale. Il y a également des aides à la pierre. C'est donc un outil extrêmement important qui est fait sur 3 piliers. La participation, l'épargne populaire, le livret A, la participation des employeurs et une gestion patrimoniale de long terme. Et c'est ce qui permet de loger les ménages modestes. Et vous le voyez sur ce graphique, les locataires d'un logement HLM, ils ont des revenus en moyenne autour de 15 000 euros à l'année, ce qui est beaucoup moins que l'ensemble de la population française et que des propriétaires qui, eux, sont à 26 000 euros. Les défis du logement social, ils sont énormes. Le premier en France, c'est que nous avons aujourd'hui 2,6 millions de ménages, pas de personnes, de ménages qui attendent un logement social en France, essentiellement avec une très forte augmentation depuis le Covid, et qui est très liée à vraiment la disparition d'un parc locatif privé à louer et d'un marché de l'accession à la propriété qui est complètement... dans les choux, complètement bloqué, complètement bloqué. Ça, c'est un défi démographique. Le second défi, c'est la population française qui vieillit énormément et il va falloir aujourd'hui adapter un parc de logements à une population extrêmement vieillissante. Les défis à venir, c'est la fragilisation du financement du logement social avec... Non, ça, c'est pas très... J'ai déjà dit. Les défis du financement du logement social, aujourd'hui, la difficulté, c'est qu'il y a un retrait très clair des financements publics et notamment de l'État. Il y a même eu, depuis 2018, une volonté de prendre dans les ressources du parc social français pour financer le budget national. Ainsi, depuis 2018, il manque à peu près 11 milliards d'euros aux bailleurs sociaux pour investir, puisqu'en fait, c'est une ponction qui a été prise par l'État. Et par ailleurs, vous dire que si le parc HLM est en tête de la rénovation et de la décarbonation de ces logements, nous ne bénéficions pas d'aide publique nationale sur le sujet, qui pose quand même des questions. Et enfin, un dernier sujet sur lequel l'OCDE s'est déjà à plusieurs reprises travaillé, c'est la question de la financiarisation de ce parc HLM. La chance pour la France, c'est d'avoir un parc de logement pour des publics modestes, qui sont des key workers, et de pouvoir offrir continuellement un loyer modéré, bien en deçà du marché. Le risque aujourd'hui, c'est de céder à ces systèmes de financiarisation, ce qu'on voit en fait dans la production immobilière classique, qui est de vendre ce parc HLM pour le parc privé et qui ne sera plus régulé. Et ça sera une perte d'atout pour la France pour évidemment répondre aux enjeux actuels. Et c'est d'ailleurs pour ça que nous travaillons et nous allons travailler beaucoup avec la Commission européenne sur la définition prochaine de sa politique envers le logement. Voilà, merci pour votre attention.
Merci beaucoup, Emmanuel, spécialement pour toutes les données, la richesse de les données.
Un peu trop.
Non, pas du tout trop, parce que ça montre ce que nous pouvons tout faire avec les données en fonction de l'analyse. Et moi, j'étais vraiment impressionné avec toutes les données que vous avez à propos des financements, parce que c'est là où nous avons une grande challenge. Donc, maintenant, je vais rentrer en anglais et je vais passer les questions et la parole à... Excusez-moi. So, Matthew Baldwin, the Deputy Director General of the Director General for Energy and Housing. And of course, as you've heard a couple of times now, there's now for the first time a Commissioner responsible for housing at the Commission. This is another illustration of the importance that's being attached to the housing crisis and the challenges that we have around housing. So Matthew, the question to you is the EC has placed the housing crisis high in its policy agenda, even though housing traditionally is a national or a sub-national responsibility. So what specific instruments, mechanisms or policy levers is the Commission planning to deploy to support Member States in tackling the housing crisis across Europe?
Thank you very much, Nadim. Good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be here. It's a perfect mix. The OECD and cities. Who could ask for more in terms of the combination? OECD because of the profound way in which you've been looking at housing, both at the national and the subnational level, and I've had some very useful discussions with you and your colleagues today, Nadim. For example, the Horizontal Housing Initiative, everything you've been doing in terms of the reform agenda, the policy toolkit. And, you know, Europe only dares to tread gently where the OECD has already put its feet, so that's great. And, of course, cities, because cities are the champions of any problem that Europe needs to tackle, really. If there's a crisis, it's often felt in its most extreme form in cities first. You're at the point of the spear in terms of affordable housing. But you also have the solutions in your hands. You have the educated, cosmopolitan population, the densification of your population. So mobility solutions, climate solutions come most naturally to you. And of course, housing is a European problem and a problem that you are addressing so well together. And so, yeah, indeed, we do want to assist you in your efforts. And behind your question, Nadim, is the implied point that it's right that Europe should tread lightly in this affair. It is correct that it is for member states and regions and cities to have the primary responsibility for delivering housing, affordable housing specifically. And so whatever we need to do needs to respect, in a dynamic, not just a sort of a nominal way, subsidiarity. We need to recognize the efforts that have gone before us, and we're trying to support them. But at the same time, as President von der Leyen said in her policy guideline speech back in July, if this is an issue for Europeans, then it's an issue for Europe. And it is an issue for Europeans, very plainly, and I won't repeat everything that Andre has said so well, and Emmanuel has explained so well as to why it's such a tough issue. But very briefly, prices are going crazy, both for the purchase of housing and, of course, for rents. Homelessness is through the roof. We spent some time this afternoon discussing with your colleagues how to measure homelessness. And it's interesting to hear Andre's numbers. The numbers I'm using are more than 1 million across the European Union, and around 400,000 children are affected by homelessness. It's a supply crunch, of course. It's not immune from the market, and we need to address those causes of the supply crunch. And I think the last point is, and why it's important we get stuck in, it's also an issue beyond Europe. And I think we're going to hear today how much work has been done at the global level before Europe has come to this issue. So what can Europe do, to come to your point? Is it a case, as in Stalin's famous question, of how many military divisions does the Pope have? What can Europe bring to this issue? And firstly, I think it's by raising the issue on the European stage. You referred to it kindly. We have the first ever, and I trust not the last ever, Commissioner for Housing, Dan Jorgensen, who combines his responsibility for housing with energy. We have established this first task force for housing, which I have the honor to lead, which is a coordinating team. We're not trying to take over all the strands of work that already exist inside the Commission. DG Employment's work very closely with the OECD, DG ECFIN as well. All the work that's going on in DG Competition in relation to state aids, all the work on regional policy. This must grow, not shrink, and we'll be trying to help it grow and not trying to take it over. And in raising this issue on the European stage, the first thing we can do in Europe, the European Commission in particular, is not always best at this, saying, we don't have all the answers, we would like to listen to you, to learn from you. Another quote from that era of Churchill, of Attlee, he's a modest man with much to be modest about. We are modest in our knowledge and our certainties in this field, and we will listen in this first year. And we'll listen in close liaison with the European Parliament, which has organized a special committee, originally called the House Committee, to tackle this issue, and we'll work closely with them. So what are the instruments? Firstly, I think we'll be light on regulation, if we'll do anything at all. I don't think Europe is looking for the European Commission to wade in with big, strong regulatory tools. If anything, we'll be looking, as is the vogue, at what regulations we can simplify or address to make the provision of housing easier. We'll be looking at funding and finance flows, grand European title, the pan-European investment platform. We are looking at that. Yes, obviously with the European Investment Bank, but also with the Council of Europe Bank, which has such a strong record of investing in social housing, with the national promotional banks, such as the Caisse des Dépôts and others. We want to see a really inclusive approach to address, as far as possible, all the potential funding and finance flows to support housing efforts across Europe. And in particular, those public finance flows which will leverage and drive additional private money to come into the market. We'll be looking at the state aids regime, which you referred to, Emmanuel, so eloquently, and your views are very clear on this. And it's tricky because, of course, the definitions of social housing differ all across the European Union, 27 different definitions, and therefore the definition of what is affordable must also take its cue from that. But I think it's very clear that my friends in DG Comp are really want to make sure they don't undermine that social housing provision, and that will be very important to them. You mentioned, Andre, what we're doing on cohesion, and to make one small clarification there, yes, we are doubling the amount of money that member states and cities and regions can spend on housing, but whether or not they do so will be up to you, the member states, the cities, the regions. And I do urge you to take advantage of this opportunity. It will mean, in many cases, reprogramming what has already been done with some generous co-financing and pre-financing support. But please do so, because if you don't take up this chance, then it comes to the next financing period. It'll say, well, there wasn't so much interest in this last round. We're looking at speculation. We're looking at financialization. We're looking at short-term rentals in all as Andre explained how important these are. And we'll be looking again in the context of simplification, I'm sure, at this whole issue around permitting and what is impeding permitting at the European and at the national and at the local level. A big challenge, but very important in the context also of the European construction strategy, which will be coming forward in the same time frame. So it's a joined-up effort across the Commission, and I think we need a joined-up effort across Europe at all levels of government. At the European level, yes, we're coming into this for the first time to support the efforts at the national and the city level. I'm very pleased, Andre, to hear now that the number of mayors for cities is up to 15. Every time I turn around, it's growing. At the time of Chairman Mao, they were satisfied with a gang of 4, and you're up to 15. And so long may this continue. And please bring the medium-sized and the small cities into this game as well, because they have many issues. And last but not least, let's look at the best possible practice that we can learn from each other and apply them in a sensible way to address this crisis. And all of this, we hope, will then come together in a pragmatic, strong and sustained in terms of the length of time effort that we can bring to this at the European level in our first ever European affordable housing plan in the first quarter of next year. And we look forward to working with each and every one of you. Thank you in advance for those efforts. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I love the historical quotes, but I should correct you. I think that you are modest, but I think you have an awful lot to crow about, and so you do yourself a disservice when you say you have lots to be modest about. So I think that it certainly is an awful lot. I think we can get stuck into them. From our side, we certainly, as I said over lunch, will look ready to support you on the work on the task force, and happy to do that. We've heard now, I think, from the supranational. We're going to go down and have a conversation with a mayor. And again, I'm going to switch to my awful French. So please, apologies to the French in the audience, but I will now move to French.
And she has to put up with British tourists.
that too. Donc, je vous introduis à Nathalie Appareil, le maire de Rennes. Donc, Nathalie, la ville de Rennes a adopté des politiques publiques ambitieuses et volontaristes pour accroître l'offre de logements sociaux et abordables en réponse à une croissance démographique soutenue et à une demande accrue en logement. Donc, quels sont les principaux défis liés au logement auxquels les habitants de Rennes sont actuellement confrontés et comment la municipalité a-t-elle choisi d'y répondre dans le cadre de la stratégie en matière d'habitat?
Merci, bonsoir à toutes et tous et merci de me permettre de m'exprimer à la fois en français et de vous parler de Rennes, qui est un territoire de 500 000 habitants à l'ouest de la France, capitale de la Bretagne. Un territoire qui n'échappe pas à la crise du logement qui a pu être décrite par les uns et les autres. Je n'y reviendrai pas, sinon pour dire que malgré des politiques anciennes et volontaristes sur ce territoire, nous sommes confrontés véritablement à ce défi de la disponibilité des logements, notamment parce que, vous l'avez dit, la croissance démographique est forte, mais aussi parce que le nombre d'individus par logement continue à diminuer considérablement, et puis un problème de cherté, un problème de prix. Et lorsque nous regardons au niveau national les racines du phénomène, nous voyons qu'en gros, depuis les années 2000, on a une décorrélation de plus en plus forte entre la croissance de la courbe des revenus et la croissance de la courbe des prix du logement. Et on a parfois pu penser que l'augmentation des taux d'intérêt était à l'origine, en France et en Europe, des difficultés liées au logement et au prix du logement. En fait, cette croissance des taux d'intérêt, cette crise des taux d'intérêt est plutôt un révélateur d'un système qui, structurellement, dysfonctionne avec des prix du logement qui ne tiennent pas compte des revenus et avec des risques démocratiques et de cohésion sociale qui sont extrêmement puissants derrière ça, parce que d'abord il n'y a rien de plus intime que de pouvoir se loger, et en même temps il n'y a rien de plus politique que le sujet du logement dans nos villes. Comment est-ce qu'on fait à la fois que nos territoires n'excluent personne et qu'il n'y ait pas de ressentiment à devoir habiter là où on ne choisit pas d'habiter et parfois à 30, 40, 50 km de son travail avec toutes les difficultés que ça peut supposer. Et puis, comment est-ce qu'on construit sa vie quand on consacre 40 à 50% de son revenu mensuel à se loger, ce qui laisse un pouvoir de vivre extrêmement réduit derrière. Donc on est vraiment confronté à ces difficultés et à ces dysfonctionnements majeurs pour lesquels nous avons la conviction à Rennes que la réponse n'est pas dans moins de règles, mais au contraire dans un encadrement plus important. Je le dis parce que lorsque quelquefois on fait le lien avec les taux d'intérêt, on se dit que finalement le marché va faire en sorte que tout cela se régule par sa main invisible valeureuse et qu'il est sans doute grand temps d'alléger les normes environnementales, d'alléger les normes sociales, d'alléger les normes de construction. Si nous ne sommes pas capables de concilier la justice sociale liée au logement avec la transition climatique, alors il n'y aura pas de solutions durables. D'où le fait que les solutions ne sont vraisemblablement pas dans l'allègement des normes, qui est parfois une tentation très importante. Au contraire, nous avons besoin de renforcer la qualité thermique des logements, nous avons besoin de faire en sorte que la sobriété foncière soit là, que la construction soit la plus durable possible, les matériaux les plus biosourcés, tout en réussissant à contenir les prix. Et lorsque l'on interroge les habitants de nos territoires sur leurs attentes, ils n'attendent souvent pas de nous que nous ne lâchions prise. Au contraire, ils nous demandent cette régulation. Ils considèrent que c'est une exigence démocratique qu'ils peuvent avoir vis-à-vis de nous, élus, que de leur permettre de se loger. Alors, plus concrètement, comment faire sur un territoire comme le nôtre? Eh bien, c'est utiliser tous les leviers de l'encadrement. Tout ce qui permet la régulation et singulièrement la régulation publique. Et permettez-moi une expression un peu provocatrice, considérant que le marché ne produit rien de bon en matière de logement et qu'il a besoin d'être régulé là où c'est possible à l'échelle de nos territoires. C'est bien sûr la réponse telle que l'a détaillé Emmanuel sur le logement social. Qui est accessible à 70% de la population française et qui est une réponse extrêmement importante pour laquelle nous sommes confrontés à la diminution des interventions et des crédits d'intervention de l'État, avec la possibilité plus ou moins grande pour les territoires de venir compenser cette diminution. Nous avons fait le choix de continuer à produire à l'échelle de notre territoire 1500 logements sociaux par an, sur un parc de 250 000 à peu près, en y consacrant près de 50 millions d'euros de fonds locaux en lieu et place des aides d'État qui ont été supprimées depuis 2017. C'est l'un des premiers budgets de la collectivité parce que c'est à la base de la cohésion sociale et du pacte démocratique à l'intérieur de notre territoire. Donc le logement social, mais aussi un travail particulier sur l'accession à la propriété. Il y a, dans la représentation française en tout cas, du logement, un attachement particulier à la propriété. Être chez soi, pouvoir se constituer un patrimoine, pouvoir, le cas échéant, le transmettre à ses enfants, assurer ses vieux jours, ça fait partie des attentes qui peuvent s'exprimer par rapport au logement. Et nous avons cherché à répondre à cette question particulière en se demandant comment est-ce qu'on pouvait se permettre aux ménages d'avoir un patrimoine qui ne soit pas de la spéculation. Et tout l'enjeu de sortir le logement de sa définition aujourd'hui de bien spéculatif, parce que nous pensons que l'origine du problème est là. Un bien patrimonial, oui, un bien spéculatif, non. Et tant qu'on considère le logement comme un secteur lucratif et juteux pour les fonds de pension, avec l'idée qu'il y ait un rendement bancaire maximum, alors nous ne parvenons pas à satisfaire les besoins de la population. D'où la généralisation pour nous d'un système d'office foncier solidaire qui nous permet cette dissociation systématique pour la quasi-totalité des logements construits désormais entre le sol, qui reste un bien commun, qui reste propriété de la collectivité, qui sort de la spéculation parce que la terre, elle nous appartient, et le bâti, qui, lui, est peut-être pleinement propriété des ménages qui en font l'acquisition. Et en généralisant ce système, on arrive à plafonner les prix de sortie pour faire en sorte qu'ils soient proportionnels aux revenus. C'est un système qui nous permet désormais à ce que 9 locataires sur 10, à l'échelle de la métropole, puissent être propriétaires pour un montant de remboursement d'emprunt qui est à peu près équivalent au loyer qu'ils pouvaient payer auparavant dans le parc privé. Et donc ça vient fluidifier tout le système parce que des locataires du parc privé peuvent accéder à la propriété et donc des locataires dans une trajectoire ascendante du parc social peuvent accéder aussi au logement privé et des personnes en difficulté de logement, au bout de la chaîne, peuvent accéder au logement social qui sinon est complètement engorgé. Donc c'est le pari de réintroduire de la fluidité par de l'accès à la propriété pour des ménages qui imaginaient que définitivement acheter dans nos villes, ce n'était pas possible parce que c'était trop cher. Là, ça redevient possible. Pour donner un ordre de grandeur, pour des revenus qui peuvent aller jusqu'à 7 500 € pour un couple avec 2 enfants, ce qui, au regard de l'échelle des revenus français, correspond effectivement à plus de 90% de la population. Et selon le revenu, le prix va être encadré, ce qui a pour vertu aussi de faire baisser les prix sur le parc existant. Parce qu'en matière de logement, il y a les flux, ce que nous pouvons construire, et puis il y a le parc existant qui est quand même l'essentiel des logements disponibles. Et lorsque l'on fait baisser les prix sur le neuf, alors on fait aussi baisser les prix sur l'ancien. Voilà une des pistes que nous creusons aujourd'hui et que nous avons généralisées depuis quelques mois. La ville de Rennes produit à elle seule déjà plus de la moitié des logements français qui se construisent sur cette dissociation entre le foncier et le bâti. Et plus de la moitié, Emma. Et en tout cas, ne souhaite qu'une seule chose, c'est que ce modèle puisse, s'il est vertueux, inspirer aussi d'autres territoires. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Nathalie. Donc, il y a peut-être un désagrément à propos de le données, mais je sais qu'ici, nous avons...
On est très amis.
Donc, vous avez touché sur beaucoup de sujets. Moi, je voudrais savoir... j'espère qu'on a l'opportunité de retourner à cette discussion de spéculation. Que le logement comme un instrument financier, c'est quelque chose qui est vraiment pertinent à cette discussion. Donc, now I'm going to pass back to English, and I'm going to have the opportunity to introduce you to José Manuel Ribeiro, the Mayor of Valongo in Portugal. So, José, Valongo has demonstrated strong local leadership in addressing housing needs through its local housing strategy, which aims to provide dignified and affordable housing solutions for hundreds of families. So how is Valongo mobilising public, private and community actors to implement long-term housing solutions? And what role do you see for international cooperation in scaling and sharing these efforts?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm a mayor in Porto metropolitan area in Portugal, and well, I'm a practitioner. Mayors, we implement policies. The big strength of mayors is that we are part of the capillarity. All policies need mayors to implement. The problem is that as a mayor, and answering your question, we are trying to do the best with the money we get from the state, from the European Union, because housing, it's the huge amount of money. It's not, we can't do it with our budgets. Let's be honest, it's impossible. So I'm not going to lose time with that. But with that money, we try to do our best. But let's be honest, we are giving an answer for social housing. And inside social housing, we are answering the poorest of the poor. I am mayor for the last 11 years, 5 months and 22 days, I think. I always say this because we are temporary. A lot of politicians should remember that we are temporary. Like we are alive, temporary. And I see what happens. And sometimes I ask, what is the importance of having a house? Having a house is like a castle. If you don't have your castle, you don't have dignity. Why I say this? Because as my friend, mayor of Rennes, and other mayors here, we invest all the time, we invest a lot of money in education, in culture, you know, giving all the opportunities to empower people. And when someone doesn't have a house, and nowadays the problem is much worse, because what I see in my region is that I see young educated people that they don't have a house. Young couples, highly educated, they can't afford to pay rents. Let's be honest. And at the end of the day, you were investing in education, giving access to books, culture, and in the end of the day, everything just goes away. Like Sisyphus curse, you know? Sisyphus, every day. That's the consequence of not having house. What strikes me most is that it's really incredible. I'm not against the market. I'm a social democrat, a very moderate. I'm a radical moderate guy. But what strikes me incredibly is that it's very hard for us to recognize that the market sometimes fails. Let's be honest, my friends. It's nothing against the market. The market is not solving this problem. And I know, because I read, I ask, I'm a member of the Committee of the Regions, and we are trying to do, it's like we are studying, like Matthew, we are studying a lot, but it's not a question of studying, it's a question of acting. Yeah. And we see, for example, Singapore, good idea, but the solution is public money. I'm not talking about Vienna, because that's the perfect case. It's public money. Don't forget, I'm very concerned with this because we, mayors, don't have money enough to solve this problem. Let's be honest. And what is the consequence of not solving this problem? That this, nowadays, this new, and I think it's not an European-only problem, it's a world problem. This lack of dignity is corroding the social cement. I don't like the office. I like to be in the street all day. I hate to be in the office. Everybody that knows me, my friend Ricardo knows, I'm always, all the time in the street. I like to talk with people. I have to go there to sign some papers, of course, sometimes electronic, but you have to go there. You have to go there. But whenever you go to the street, you have the chance to talk with people. To talk with the eyes, not with mobiles, you know? And you see anger. I see that sometimes. I'm not being, listen, I'm not exaggerating. You only see that when you look to the eyes, not through your smartphones. I talk with guys and girls, men and women, highly educated. They hate politicians because they feel that we are not doing whatever we can to solve their problem. Imagine, and we can understand that. The story they have is the story of their father and mother and grandfather and grandmother. The golden age. You know, you had a job, you have a nice house, two cars. Now, they can't do it. Imagine, a highly educated guy. And now, and after, we are surprised. Why? That's, let's be honest. We can't say that. We know why. We know that it's a question. We have already the universal chart says that housing is a universal right, but we don't have housing in European Union and in the States as an essential public service. My dear Matthew, turn it an essential public service. If you put it in the law, it has consequences. I'm a guy of the law. The law, yeah, I am a very big fan of the law. Because if you put it on the law, you have to densify it. You have to arrange money, get money to do it, because it's in the law. So when I was asked to share what I think about, I said, I don't know if we are going to like what I'm going to say, because I'm a little bit fed up of these. You know, it's a kind of circular talk. Apologize my onomatopoeia. I like onomatopoeia. So it's all the time like this. And we're not solving absolutely nothing. Because I know that we have some examples, good examples, that are solving segregation problems, solving some problems. But if we don't solve all the problems, we have very big problems in our communities. And we can see that. We can see that in the number of abstention. More than 50%, they don't vote. The number of people that don't read. The number of people that don't go to the theater. Why? Because they are the first priority, the second and the third priority is to survive, to have a castle. So my opinion is that we should be more, I'm going to finish like Matthew with Churchill. You know, Churchill said that the first human quality is courage, because without courage, you don't have the other qualities. And we can say the same, without house, affordable, adequate house, you cannot be an empowered citizen. So thank you very much.
Super. Many thanks, Jose. We'll have a chance, I think, to come back to some of the questions around market failures, and we're very lucky to have Alain de Serres here from the Economics Directorate who'll perhaps respond to some of those. I mean, it's a difficult question to respond to. I mean, for me, scarcity of land has always been one of the, I think, factors that create some of these challenges for the market. But certainly there are problems that we have to fix, and you made that very passionate. I'm going to pass now to Angelica Nunez, the Practice Manager for Urban and Land at the World Bank. So, Angelica, the World Bank has been actively engaged in supporting countries to develop more inclusive and resilient housing finance systems, with a particular focus on improving access to affordable housing in informal settlements and for lower and middle income households. So what financing models or mechanisms have proven most effective in unlocking investment for affordable housing and urban regeneration, particularly in a context of limited fiscal space? I'm going to remind everybody as well, we've got 5 minutes each.
Yes, thank you. Well, first, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's an incredibly interesting group of people and speakers, but also in the audience. Very briefly, for the World Bank, housing is one of the cornerstones of economic development, right? Having access, and I think we all agree here on having access to adequate, accessible, and affordable housing has enormous benefits. These are proven benefits at the household level, but also at the community level. So it is a bundle that brings together the family and the community and allows for development to happen. World Bank has a track record of more than 50 years of lending to low and middle income countries for housing. Over 101 countries, 310 projects around that. I want to share with you a little bit of the lessons that what we have learned of what has worked and what hasn't. Please bear in mind that the countries where we work are very different to the countries that have been presenting here. So you will hear perhaps something a little different, not different, but not necessarily fully aligned. In case you're not familiar, the World Bank very briefly supports governments through the World Bank, through projects and loans. We also have our private IFC, which lends to the private sector. So let me share some of the reflections that we have found, because we provide loans, but they are a tiny drop in the ocean for what is needed in the countries, right? The estimates from UN Habitat is that the world will need around 1.6 billion houses to be produced between now and 2030, which can actually increase to 3 billion, depending on the circumstances. So, I mean, whatever we provide in money, of course, is certainly not that amount. No? So the first lesson is that there is really no substitute for a coherent regulatory environment. There is no money that can fix a flawed regulatory environment and failing institutions in the sector. This doesn't necessarily mean more. It can mean less sometimes, but
there needs to be a macroeconomic stability and a coherent policy environment. And when I say coherent, I mean that it has to be thought at the vertical level, what the nation has to do, what the province or the department has to do, and what the city has to do. And in many of our client countries, they forget about the city and they think that the national level can do it all. And unfortunately, we see a lot of mistakes happening because of that. But it also has to be look at the entire value chain of the house, starting by the land and land markets, the infrastructure, the developer sector, which is very neglected in many of the countries, and not just the end user. The end user is almost, it's not easy, but it's less complicated in a way to address, with money at least. No? So the second point is, when we're talking about policy coherence, what we mean is that there has to be a clarity of what is a public sector responsibility and what is a private sector responsibility. And when I say private sector, I don't mean only the developers or the banks. I mean the households as well, the beneficiaries, the people that need a house. In the countries where we work, these are the people that pay the most. Living in a slum on a per square meter basis is more expensive than many of the cities, of the well-off cities. So the people are putting enormous effort already. How can we leverage the effort that they are putting to provide a much better solution than what we have? You'd be surprised, the many countries where we work, where if you ask the mayor, he thinks his responsibility is something, but if you ask a developer, they think it's a different one, and the national level, there is no agreement of who needs to do what to be able to deliver the supply of housing that is needed, or at least at the scale that is needed. No? I think the other part that is confused or not clear, and a little bit of mea culpa on the institutions like the World Bank, that we hadn't really grasped the importance of the role of urban planning and zoning and what cities can do to catalyze housing. And this has been at the cost of tremendous urban expansion in developing countries, which is very costly, it's unsustainable, it's ineffective, it's bad for the households, it's bad for the environment, it's just bad for everybody. And we believe that it's not just having the plans and the zonings in many of the places where we work, it's really the enforcement of these plans and this zoning that is very weak and where we see a lot of potential to support these countries. Now, some good examples, because not everything is terribly dire, that we have where we've seen systems that have worked after looking at the policy coherence and the robust institutions. We've seen some success on demand-driven subsidies. We believe, very much like some of the speakers, that the market will not address this on its own. We don't know a single country where the market addresses the failures and provides a solution for every segment of the population. So if you leave it to the market, it's probably the top percent, typically in the countries where we work, that will be served, and the rest will be living in a precarious or in a slum setting. We also believe, however, that the public sector cannot do it all. And the fiscal constraints in these countries are tremendous. So we cannot afford, many of our countries cannot afford to have the type of social housing that is available for some of the countries or the examples that we've seen here. So we cannot afford not to bring the market or the private sector, and I mean the households as well, and to leverage every possible source of effort and of funding. Neighborhood improvement is a big bang for the buck because we believe that you use the household's efforts and resources. We believe, however, that has to be done not just on the focus on the houses. That normally doesn't have so much results. It has to be at the level of the neighborhood to really bring resources. Many of these neighborhoods, what they lack is attention. They don't see the presence of the state. They don't see the services that are provided. And when you bring the house with the services, it's far more effective. People don't just need walls and ceiling. They typically need a bundle of services. And that has been more effective when you combine it with microloans or with affordable loans by community lenders that are regulated to some extent, or where there is some form of credit enhancement provided by the state. We've also seen very good results with demand-driven subsidies. Colombia and a lot of countries in Latin America have used this effectively. When they are designed with strong public-private coordination and they're well-targeted and they're transparent, and particularly when they're time-bound, they can really be helpful in increasing the supply of affordable housing. For larger cities, for cities where you can really leverage the value of the land in central locations, we have had good examples of PPPs for urban redevelopment. Brazil is a good example of that, where there is really the opportunity to use the mixed-use type of development to cross-subsidize uses where there's huge profitability for social, to subsidize or cross-subsidize with uses where there is much less profitability or zero profitability. And we've also had very good examples on how segmenting the market and providing solutions for specific target populations, industrial workers, employer-based housing, students as well. We would like to see also, we think, and we'd like to see more opportunities in rental housing. A lot of the countries where we work, unfortunately, have sort of blindly followed the ownership model. And it is not necessarily a model that will be sufficient or will be able to provide. Not everybody can own a house, at least not at the beginning. And we need to use the system of a property ladder concept. We also think the model of land development that is used in some countries where you unbundle the house and the land, which is what really creates the value, and then you do land value capture, and then you use that to compensate for the provision of social housing. That is also a model the way we believe there is a lot of opportunity. And one segment where we think a lot needs to be done, at least in the low and middle income countries, is on the developer sector. This sector typically is a mishmash of very large, successful developers and then a very heterogeneous group with sometimes very low skills, lack of access to finance, lack of proper standards or transparency. We see a lot of properties abandoned in the middle of the construction, which reduces the trust in the sector, which has like a negative effect in medium term. We finally, just to finalize, from the level of institutions like OECD, the data that is provided is tremendously useful for countries to establish that regulatory environment, those institutions. There is never one solution. The housing sector keeps evolving. Even in countries that have been successful, they find new problems or new challenges, and data is always, I think, something that is worth investing. Thank you very much.
Super, many thanks, Angelica. You started by saying that there were perhaps not many lessons that the countries around the table could learn, but actually there was quite a few lessons I think the countries could learn from your experiences. In particular, getting access to private finance and land value capture in particular, I think, is certainly something that we're seeing increasingly used. So lessons shared, I think. I'm going to pass the floor now to Jonathan Reckford, the Director General of Habitat for Humanity International. So Jonathan, Habitat for Humanity International advocates for policies to increase affordable and decent housing, especially in the world's poorest communities. How do you work with local communities and policymakers to implement scalable solutions that ensure access to decent and affordable housing for all? And mindful of time, I shall remind 5 minutes as well. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with all of you, and I will try to build but not replicate some of what Angelica shared. For those of you who are not familiar, Habitat for Humanity is an NGO. We're almost 50 years old and have helped now 62 million people have new or improved housing in about 70 countries. Most of our work is in the Global South, though we're anomalous in that we have 1,000 housing organizations in the United States, so we're one of the largest private home builders there. So we see both North and South. Our vision is a world where everyone has a decent place to live, and I think for us, it's a both and. We need more public investment in housing everywhere. And I would also agree that's insufficient. There's not enough public subsidy to be able to meet the housing needs. So we also need to leverage an enormous amount of private capital. And so how do we create the right environments to attract private capital as well? And I want to, we realized many years ago that we could never build our way out of the challenge, and that really led us into thinking more systemically, how do we impact whole housing value chains in a way that can make the markets work more effectively so that families can improve their own housing. And in the Global South, for a huge amount of the population, the way they build is incrementally. They can't afford and under any circumstances to be able to purchase or build a home or finance a home, a complete home, but they can over time be able to improve that. And so if we think systematically, and I'll do this very quickly, we really started with property rights, because if you don't have the right to stay on land, it doesn't make sense to invest. And so our first global campaign was really around land rights for mostly women and marginalized groups in the Global South. We've now evolved into our next campaign around upgrading informal settlements, a lot of the similar principles to be able to formalize and unlock the potential, because there's huge potential there. It's mostly extracted, and the families aren't benefiting from the relatively high rents they're paying, as Angela said. I want to give two practical examples. We've done work around trying to move towards building materials, towards skilled labor, but the giant impediment for so many families is housing finance and access to finance. And so we set out, starting almost 20 years ago, we started doing experiments in housing microfinance and trying to generate a new asset class. The microfinance industry scaling for small business loans, the thesis was you couldn't do housing loans. We actually showed and launched 12 years ago MicroBuild, a debt fund, $100 million debt fund. Now that fund has loaned out $230 million to 62 financial microfinance institutions in 36 countries, along with technical assistance to train them on how to start housing portfolios. Their housing lending has actually outperformed their small business lending consistently. The nicest proof point is those microfinance banks have now put in $1.2 billion of their own capital into their housing portfolios. So we're starting to see scale. We've directly helped 1 million people have home improvements, but now with that's millions more who are getting them through the additional capital, and we're now going for a much larger fundraise for the next fund. But I think that's an idea that can scale, because right now, you know, in most of the Global South, only 5 to 10% of the population can get a bank loan for housing. So how do you build if you can't get finance? A second one is a compromise breaker, and we're doing this in 7 countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and it's around breaking the compromise between climate and affordability. And so many families in Central and Eastern Europe are living in old Soviet-era apartment blocks that were privatized with no common area reserves and no homeowners associations. So there was no incentive or structure to do repairs or improvement. And when they started, energy was relatively free. Fast forward, energy is no longer free, and energy poverty is becoming a real issue. What we found is catalytic subsidy, a small subsidy to create a homeowners association and actually create a functioning cooperative group within these buildings. Once you have a functional homeowner association, we're lending capital to the homeowner association to do energy retrofits of the building, dramatically improving the health and livability of the buildings, and then they can actually pay back the loans out of the reduction in energy costs for the families. So that, we think, is a highly growable idea, and we're rolling that out to more countries. But it is lots more stories, but I do think it's an all of the above. There's no magic bullets in any of this, but what we do see in the Global North certainly is the need to make it faster and easier to build. I would gently push back that all regulation is helpful. We've actually seen regulation and zoning be the absolute enemy of getting enough housing built, and we need a lot more supply, both qualitative and quantitative, and I will stop at exactly 5 minutes.
Many thanks, Jonathan, in particular because I think you actually illustrated there were 2 places where there are solutions linked to market failures. I mean, certainly on the micro build, but also this idea of having this collective to fix that market failure. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to move now to the last intervention that we have on this particular session, and that's to Aline Matta. I'm not quite sure where... Oh, there you are. And Alina used to be in our team, of course, and so she's now the Senior Program Manager Management Officer at UN Habitat. So Eleni, UN Habitat provides technical expertise and policy support to countries worldwide in developing more effective housing strategies, and recently set up an open-ended intergovernmental expert working group on adequate housing for all, co-chaired by France and Kenya. What are the main findings or directions emerging from that initiative?
Thank you, Director. It's a pleasure to be back at this house. I'm really glad to be here. I just want, first of all, to convey the apologies of the Executive Director of UN Habitat, because as you heard earlier, she had to leave to take a flight, but she asked me to convey 3 key messages related to what the working group has been advancing so far. The first point relates to scale and drivers of housing inadequacy. So basically what the working group has identified relates to the scale of the issue, and that it continues to grow, as we heard from colleagues from the World Bank and also from Jonathan just right now. It reflects a deep and systematic challenges. So to share with you some of the key figures that the UN Habitat has been working with the working group so far. So UN Habitat estimates that between 1.6 and 3 billion people lack adequate housing, and that more than 1.12 billion are living in informal settlements and slums, and these numbers are from 2022, which means that at least 130 million more, we have 130 million more than what we had in 2015. The other figure that the UN Habitat has identified as part of the work that's done with this working group relates to illustrating the complexity of slums dynamics. So basically, since 2000, almost 70 million people have lifted out of slum living conditions, mostly in Latin America. However, 260 million people have been added since then. So this is just to illustrate what's the scale of the issue that we are dealing with right now. So some of the key drivers that the working group has identified related to mainly 5 key points. The first is rapid urbanization and how this is helping to outpace the provision of adequate housing. The second relates to low and declining public investment in housing, and how this can be combined with an over-reliance or on a market-led approach that simply don't reach the poorest or most vulnerable groups. The third key driver relates to the dominant focus on supply that also tends to overlook or underappreciate the housing solutions. The fourth, of course, is the climate crisis and how climate change and conflict are accelerating displacement. And the final key driver that the working group has identified relates to the systematic inequality that includes gender-based discrimination, lack of land rights, and exclusion based on disability, migration status, and ethnicity. So these are basically the key drivers that have been identified now. So in terms of key directions of the working group, what has been discussed so far is that the working group is emphasizing that adequate housing must be seen not only as a human right, but also a foundational for health, inclusion, climate resilience, economic opportunity, and shared prosperity. There is also a lot of concern related to the need to have integrated approaches and linking how we can better link housing to urban planning, access to land, transport services, job, and climate adaptation. And another key direction that the group has identified that relates to the need for strong support for diversified housing options, as was mentioned here, so including public, rental, cooperative, and community-led housing. And finally, of course, related to the financing models that must shift to align with climate and social goals alongside mechanisms that support initiatives from cities in different levels. Now, on the final point, this relates to the need to strengthening data strengthening the learning process at the city level, and also collective actions. So basically, the working group is now calling for support to better define housing affordability, to better define slums, and also in the process of collecting data and how we can better identify indicators on homelessness, informal settlements, adequacy, and affordability. A global housing platform is part of the deliveries that we are going to have at the end of the works of this working group, and the idea is that we are going to be able to support learning, coalition building, and technical exchange. So we are inviting all of you, in the name of the Executive Director of UN Habitat, to join and support the work of this working group by sharing the data that you already have, sharing best practices, and as well as participating in the activities that will be planned in the upcoming months. So thank you very much for the opportunity and for the chance to share with you.
Many thanks, Aline. I think that certainly this statement around the fact that housing is a human right will be music to Jose's ears when he referred to the importance of making this a legal requirement. So we're moving in the right direction. We're sort of now got to the point where we're going to have questions from the floor, but I'm also conscious of time, so I'm going to try to keep it relatively short. And so I'm going to open the floor now for perhaps 5 minutes and then encourage the panelists to take the question as they wish, but to try to answer it monosyllabically, yes and no, for example. So please, the floor is open. Yeah, please, take the microphone.
Hi, and thank you so much, everybody. My name is Cornelia German. I'm a student now. I'm doing a master in Sciences Po in governing the ecological transition in cities. And I'm wrapping my head around this problem of framing the social housing and how do we define exactly the problem. As Mr. Matthew Baldwin said, we don't have one definition, not even European. We don't have a global one for sure, but we don't even have maybe national definitions. And for this, I try to make it very short. I was trying to understand it a bit better, what these people need, and I was speaking to a homeless person on the street. He told me that he lives in Paris on the streets for 20 years, and I asked if he ever tried to find a housing, and he said, no, I don't need one. I have everything. But he was just living with all his luggages into suitcases. So, yeah, my question is, how do we frame the problem, and how do we involve these people in policy making? Because I think it's very important to involve them. Thank you so much.
Well, not an easy one to answer yes or no to, but who wants to have a crack at that? Matthew, I think part of it was addressed to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And partly because I'm afraid I'm going to have to go in 10 minutes, so I use an excuse. Really interesting points, and thank you for raising them. I defer to all the politicians, particularly to my right, in terms of trying to come up with what I would call a political set of principles. But given that we have 27 different social housing policies across Europe, I think you have to address the question of what additional category you'd be trying to look at from in a political way. Some people say we need to look at so you're moving from a focus just on the most vulnerable to a slightly broader focus. You mentioned it, the teachers, the social workers, the nurses, the police who can't live in the cities they serve. And I'm reminded of someone who said, try to define beauty. Well, I know it when I see it. I think there are things you're trying to do by extending that. It's a very difficult process. And I think the key thing we are trying to think of from the Commission is trying to facilitate, to enable member states and cities and regions to tackle the crisis as it evolves into this direction. And that's, I think, the best service we can do if we can achieve it technically. And good for you for talking to homeless people in the streets. Most people walk right past them, and good for engaging them. There are, I agree, a certain number of people who choose it as a lifestyle, as a choice, or it's a situation they find themselves in. For the most part, it is people who are driven to that by the economic circumstances of the situation, and you can see that by the increasing numbers of homelessness across the EU. And I think it is really behoven on us in the Commission, working again with all the different levels of government, to try to find solutions that reduce this. And again, I'm not the politician, but the politician I work for says this is unacceptable. And we have to try to find solutions to address this. In European society in the 21st century, we have to. Thank you.
Can I just say one thing?
Emmanuel.
Votre question est très intéressante, mais je pense qu'il faut faire attention à ne pas mélanger les questions. Et je partage tout à fait ce que vient de dire Mathieu. La question des personnes sans domicile pose une question de l'éradication de la pauvreté et qui va au-delà de la question de l'accès au logement. Et la question aussi que ça pose, c'est comment on produit un logement pour des personnes qui n'ont aucun moyen de payer un loyer. Et nous avons des solutions en France et nous le faisons. Et c'est un pan de la politique de lutte contre le sans-abrisme. Mais à côté de ça, il y a la politique du logement social. Alors, en plus, les mots et la traduction française, anglaise peut porter à confusion. Mais le logement social, ce n'est pas le logement des plus pauvres. Le logement social, c'est le logement des publics modestes ou à revenus moyens, qui sont aujourd'hui, par exemple, en Europe, plus de la moitié des travailleurs. Et donc, il s'agit d'avoir un logement qui réponde aux revenus des personnes. Et c'est bien la difficulté aujourd'hui, c'est que certains voudraient réduire le logement social uniquement à la question de la prise en charge des personnes sans revenus. Et ça a été une des discussions sur le logement en Angleterre il y a maintenant 20 ans. Alors qu'aujourd'hui, la question qui se pose, et notamment pour le continent européen, c'est un logement accessible, encadré et régulé pour la classe moyenne. Et c'est ça qu'on appelle le logement social. Peut-être qu'on peut trouver un autre terme. Et la dernière chose, c'est que quand on parle de logement abordable, notamment dans le secteur aujourd'hui privé, on ne parle pas du tout du logement pour la classe moyenne. On parle du logement pour loger la classe aisée, les cadres supérieurs qui ont des revenus bien plus importants et qui aujourd'hui, eux, sont capables de se manager avec le marché. Mais il faut bien comprendre qu'aujourd'hui, je pense qu'une de nos questions pour nos démocraties, et y compris pour répondre à ce qu'a dit tout à l'heure José Manuel Ribeiro, c'est vraiment la question de loger aujourd'hui pour répondre à des crises qui sont liées aux extrêmes. Comment on loge la classe active moyenne qui a des revenus moyens et qui aujourd'hui n'a aucune solution sur le marché. Et après, il y a votre question sur les sans-abri. J'ai moi-même mis en place les politiques sur le logement d'abord et l'accueil des migrants. Je crois que c'est en soi une politique globale, mais qui pose une autre question, c'est l'éradication de la pauvreté sur nos territoires qui peuvent se le permettre car nous sommes des territoires très riches.
Well, it's very, just to say something about framing. You know, framing is a very important word. The essence. You know, defense is primarily a national competence, like health. But during pandemia, we framed it. And now, during this challenge of Europe, we are framing it in defense. So it's really a matter of will. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, if there are any other questions, then raise your hand now. Otherwise, I'm going to perhaps just segue a little bit from the question we had from the questioner from Science Po to also have another, I think, intervention from our youth moment. And I think that we have an intervention from Maxwell Garcia, also from Science Po. So Maxwell, over to you.
Can you guys hear me? Okay, cool. Thank you for allowing me to speak right now. I really appreciate it. This was a really interesting discussion, and I think the last question that was posed actually really goes along with what I was hoping to say. When I found out that I was going to be doing this, I went to my Instagram story, as one does as a young person, and I asked all my friends what I should be saying. A lot of them are practicing planners and things like that. And what really inspired me in particular was engaging the youth in a way that I don't think, I mean, we've kind of touched on it, but not in a particular way. And I don't know if this applies in Europe. I'm coming from an American perspective. But a lot of my friends really highlighted the importance of local organizers and tenants unions and advocacy. A lot of them really wanted to see their voices being heard in that kind of way. I think a lot of the speakers that we've heard today, they've spoken about how it's technically easier to engage people on the ground who are living in these kinds of situations, but a lot of the time we don't really hear about the stories that we were just given in this question. So I think the most important thing that we can do right now is really lean on our local unions and our local organizations that are actively working on organizing people and making them politically participate. Because as a young person right now, as was mentioned before, it's really I'm feeling very pessimistic about my space and claiming a space in these kinds of conversations. Thank you for having me, but I really think it's important that we get on the ground and we talk to people who are like actively on the ground, speaking to tenants, speaking to people who are looking for even home ownership. Because I think there's a lot of things that can be said, not only about the regulatory frameworks, but also about dealing with private developers and things like that. So, thank you.
Super, and thank you too, Maxwell. I mean, one of the interventions that we had this morning from our Champion Mayors Initiative was from the Mayor of Skopje, and she said that, we're all sat in this room of a certain age, and we're all asking the wrong questions with the wrong answers. We need to hear the voices of the young. This is why we've had these youth moments here today. So thank you both of you for, first of all, the intervention, but also from the question, because I think it really helps the discussion. I'm now going to give the floor to Alain Serres, who's our Deputy Director from the Economics Directorate, with the perhaps very difficult task of trying to bring this all together. Alain.
Thank you, Nazim, and thanks for giving me the chance to do some closing remarks. We're in injury time, so I promise not to stand between you and the cocktail for too long. So let me start by echoing the importance of the issues discussed in the panel, which I thought was really great discussion. According to a recent survey, 2024, around 25% of the population in OECD countries see housing as one of the three most important issues in their countries. And we all know that there's been quite a number of other issues that came up in recent times. Also, in many countries, the share of population that is dissatisfied with housing services is well above 2/3 of the population. Of course, and this was really highlighted and mentioned, the main reason is that the share of household income that is absorbed by housing cost has risen sharply over the years. Just in the decade prior to the pandemic, the share increased on average by 5 percentage points to over 30% of income, and this is for middle-income households. The situation is even worse for low-income groups, and not just in terms of housing affordability, but also with respect to the availability of amenities such as quality schooling and other basic public services. And one immediate consequence of housing developments has been the rise of homelessness, although, as was just mentioned, there are many factors at play here in this case. But the longer-term risk of such trend is that it undermines the role of cities as engines of innovation and growth, hence as a source of wealth creation and upward mobility into and for the middle class. Now, this aspect, of course, is difficult to measure, but could be one factor contributing to the slowdown in productivity that we've seen. Now, the affordability challenge largely has its roots in the housing sector's failure to supply enough dwellings where demand is strong, such as job-rich urban areas. And again, this has been highlighted in the discussion. In part, these supply-demand mismatches result from regulatory restrictions, including those related to land use and zoning provisions, which otherwise have very good objective, of course. But in some cases, the efficiency of the real estate market can also be hampered by restrictions in the rental market, such as landlord-tenant regulation, which, depending on their design, can discourage investment in the construction and upkeep of dwellings. Another challenge alongside improving affordability and efficiency is environmental sustainability, and this has two dimensions. One is the carbon footprint of the housing itself, linked to construction material and home heating, Another is the role of urban development more broadly in the net zero transition, notably by limiting urban sprawl and encouraging alternative modes of low carbon mobility. And a lot of cities and mayors we have seen are working really on that to improve the situation. Addressing these three interconnected challenges require policy actions across a wide range of domains, and the purpose of the OECD horizontal housing project that was conducted over several years and that Nazim alluded to when he showed this report at the start of the session was precisely to examine the role of policies, identifying good practices in the different areas while recognizing the potential trade-offs across the multiple objectives of housing policies. And many of the findings of this work echo the discussion from this panel. Let me just highlight a few areas of policy complementarities and trade-offs. First, land use policy reforms are often crucial to remove obstacles to expand supply in response to demand pressure and hence help mitigating house price increases in high demand areas. This can be achieved, for instance, by reducing or removing overly tight building height restrictions or minimum lot size requirements. Now, of course, reducing barriers to supply will unlikely be sufficient to fully address the issue of affordability, which is more complex. The long-standing decline in public investment in social housing that we've seen in many countries would also need to be reversed, and this would have the dual benefit of protecting low-income or vulnerable households while directly expanding the housing supply. When it comes to revenues, and this has been mentioned, and also to tax policy, relying less on housing transaction taxes and more on recurring taxes on immovable property would bring multiple benefits, especially if the base for these taxes is shifted from buildings to current land values. This is because moving away from transaction tax towards recurring taxes would also lower obstacles to residential mobility and facilitate labor market adjustments, so achieving other objectives. Now, admittedly, none of these reforms are easy, but they are examples of reforms that help addressing one or more housing objectives without necessarily conflicting with others. By contrast, some reform options involve trade-offs and therefore may need compensatory measures to ensure balanced progress. Just to give a couple of examples, greater flexibility in regulating landlord-tenant relations, including rent controls, can encourage housing investment and reduce supply-demand mismatches. However, such reforms can also penalize vulnerable incumbent tenants in the short term, possibly calling for support measures. Now, interestingly, Finland is an example of a country that successfully reformed its rental market many years ago, and the success can be attributed to the fact that it was done in a context of robust housing support for vulnerable households. Another example is more stringent environmental standards. They are necessary to achieve emission goals, but they can put upward pressure on construction and maintenance costs, which we have heard have already increased in recent years, and therefore on the house prices. Again, compensatory measures may be needed to reconcile sustainability and affordability objective, and they can involve, for example, subsidies for energy efficiency upgrading. And more broadly, this is an area where financial regulation could contribute to easing the funding of the energy transition. These interlinkages and the many more covered in the work underline the importance of efficient governance across levels and spheres of governments, as well as the government agencies responsible for housing policies. Again, this was a factor that was mentioned in the discussion. Housing policy functions are typically highly decentralized, with municipal and sub-municipal authorities having a critical role in residential land use decisions in 2/3 of OECD countries. And this creates, of course, coordination challenges. Finally, all these challenges and associated policy choices need to be considered against the background of sizable shift in technology, taste, and preference, but also taking into account country specificities. And so aside from demographic trends, changes in work practices prompted by COVID-19 and the emergence and expansion of online digital platforms for short-term rentals are having an influence on the geography and the business model of housing in ways that need to be taken into consideration. And again, we've seen and heard some mayors already taking actions to limit the extent to which the extent of the prevalence of short-term rentals. Now, let me close by saying that the main policy upshots from the horizontal project on housing that resulted in 2 reports are summarized also in a policy brief titled An Agenda for Housing Policy Reforms, and which is available from our website. Thank you again.
Super. Many thanks, Alain, and also many thanks to all the panelists for their excellent interventions and excellent responses to the questions. I think that, to be honest, this is a discussion that could have taken the whole week. We could have had a week just on housing alone, given, I think, the centrality and the importance of the subject. And I think we've seen that, from all the interventions, just how rich the discussion could have been. And we have had a rich discussion, but of course, like I said, it's a shame that we can't carry on talking. So I'm going to stop talking. Thank you all for your fantastic interventions. Thanks also to the interpreters for their brilliant job, and also for staying a little bit later than was scheduled. So thank you enormously for that. And we're going to now move to the little networking event. It's in the Roger Ockrent room, which is back in the chateau. I think if you follow the mass of humanity moving in that direction, you'll know where it is, and you'll have a chance to have a few well-earned drinks at Roger Ockrent. So thank you again to everybody.